And any second now, looks like we're live. Well, Dr. Sid, welcome to Masala Chai Theology. You made it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And folks tuning in live, apologies for the delay. We were just getting our tech sorted, make sure that we're ready for this conversation. So good to have folks hopping on. This is a hot button topic, and I mean, you know, um, this is something we do in Masala Chai Theology. Anyway, for those of you tuning in for the first time, Masala Chai Theology is a space where we essentially decolonize and we reconstruct um, theology, Christian theology, in ancient, Jesus-centered, empire-resisting, neighbor-oriented ways, in ways that sometimes leave a little bit of a spice in our mouth, in our taste palates.
Yeah.
That can upset the status quo of the spice palette, even. But that's the work that theology should be, as you know, Doctor Said. So, Doctor Said, tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, and we're going to be talking about Augustine here, all things Augustine. And as part of this larger series we're in here, which is Augustine versus Celtic Christianity.
Mhm.
So Dr. Sid, tell us who you are and any fun things you want to share about yourself. This would be
Yeah, for sure. My name is Dr. Sudiacal. My pronouns are he, him, sha. And a lot of the times people always wonder, what is the sha? So it's spelled Siya. It's actually a Filipino genderless pronoun. And so, you know, we were, I guess, like into all of that before it got trendy
nice,
because care about the person. Not the
beautiful.
gender. So I graduated with a BA in psychology, and I did my master's of the theological studies at McMaster Divinity College, and I eventually did my PhD in historical theology at McMaster Divinity College as well. One of the things that sort of uh, I did during my study was take a look at Augustine. And a huge part of, I think, whenever you go into sort of any theological issue or whatever it is, there's usually a question that sort of starts and catalyzes the whole process and the whole journey. So for me, that question was, how do you other the other when the other is not the other? And so I can maybe understand sort of the normal in-group versus out-group kind of problems that we can have, right? And so not that it's excusable, but like kind of, Christians versus Jews, or Christians versus Muslims, you kind of have these sort of very different groups that are competing, right? I guess my bigger question was like more of the internal uh, things, right? And so, why is it that Catholics and Protestants are fighting? Why is it that Baptists and Pentecostals are fighting, right? When, in terms of the system that they all sort of adhere to, they're pretty much the same. Um, and the only deviances, I would say, would be more kind of like methodological, right? And so I believe in child baptism. I don't believe in child baptism, but at the core, both groups actually still believe in baptism. So it's all of those questions that I'm just like, so how do you do that? Right? And I think sometimes we really need to recognize and realize that othering is a process. It's not something that I would say kind of just happens, right? I think it can definitely start as a conflict, which is a normal thing, right? But when that conflict actually solidifies into factions, groups, or whatever, that part is actually a process now, right? And so I was very interested in sort of uh, how do you make someone a non-Christian, right? And so a huge part of my dissertation was exploring the Donatist controversy. And a huge part of that was sort of looking at the role of disgust in how theology is processed. And so a huge issue with that is disgust is an emotion, right? It is not necessarily cognitive in nature. And so a lot of the times you realize that you're disgusted because of the actions that you've already done, right? So when I am deathly disgusted by like rats, rodents, that whole kind, right? But when I see a rat, I don't go, ha, I I see you, uh, this stimulus, and now I'm going to be disgusted. I'm usually running away already. Right? And the only reason why you know you're disgusted is because you ran. You ran for your life, um, possibly screaming along the way. Right? So it's not something that you're processing kind of like in this sort of like cognitive way that I think a lot of the times we often think of, right? And so what if, because a lot of the times too, part of the issue, oh my gosh, I know this is supposed to be just an introduction, but I'm already going into a lot of things, but eventually I'll get there. Um, but like, if you're at a place where so many of the conversations that you're having from a theological perspective
Mm,
and at an impasse, right? And it's like, well, I interpret it this way, you interpret it this way. And that's about the limitation of the conversation. Like, you can't actually go on because, you know, this is what I think, this is what I believe, or whatever, right? And I think I was mad at that because I'm just like, there's no way for us to sort of get at the root cause.
mm,
And so part of the reason why I was really interested in Disgust was because I think for me, it became almost like a very good way to level set.
mm,
And a huge part of that is because a lot of the words that we use within sort of Christianity are very loaded, right? Like, so heretic or, unbeliever or all of these things, right? And there's there's the denotation component and the connotation component. And so often we're actually talking about the connotation, which is brought about by culture, society, centuries of oppression. Uh, but
mm,
the denotation might not be necessarily that, right? And so I think for me, disgust became a way for me to sort of just like, when you are talking about this, I just want you to realize that you're using these terms with a lot of loaded emotional content.
mm.
I want you to know that loaded emotional content is disgust. you know?
Yeah.
And I think the hard part is that when you say sort of certain things in certain systems, there are so many assumptions, right? Because a heretic isn't just someone who diverges from, like, let's say, the baseline.
Mm,
A heretic is someone bad. A heretic is someone
mm.
evil. A heretic is like all of these, again, the negative connotations, right?
Wow.
But if you're going to actually just look at from like a just Merriam-Webster dictionary,
Mm,
just a divergence of the path of where that baseline is, right?
mm,
And
mm,
so maybe if we brought in disgust in our conversations, it kind of lessens that vitriol, even though it
yeah.
is actually one of the causes of the vitriol. But at the very least, the understanding that you and I, as human beings, have the capacity to be disgusted, and to be disgusted is to be human, then I
Mm,
think we're all on an even playing field.
mm,
And now the question is like, is this a proper stimulus to be disgusted by?
mm,
That becomes, I feel like, the bigger question, right? And I think it kind of, for me at least, it helps kind of get away from the theological impasse.
mm.
So, all of that to say, all of that has made me who I am.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Love it. Love it so much. And, before we even get to Augustine and the Donatist controversy and Augustine's disgust and how it's shaped the church today, which is really, the bulk of this conversation, I'd love for you to maybe give us an example of how disgust still plays out in the church today, right? And if I can maybe even steer you in one direction, something that you shared with me years ago in our first conversation, um, that has lived rent free in my head is this idea of um, disgust towards LGBTQ siblings in the church and outside the church. And you cited a fascinating research study that was done with measuring brain activity. Like tell us
Yeah.
about that. Yeah,
So,
just to give us a scale of how discuss.
yeah. And I think like when you do this type of work, it's really depressing, the things you
Yeah.
find out about humanity. And so I thought I've read the research, whatever. Like I'm unfazed, you know. But then I read this part, I was like, oh my gosh, like we're all cooked. And one of
Mm,
the things that they were looking at was sort of this study where they were looking at different people, and they were talking about sort of rating them in terms of like their warmth and kind of like competence and stuff. And so what happens in our brains is that I believe it's the medial prefrontal cortex that signals kind of like when you see someone that you know, or like humans or whatever, but like very like a person, kind of like this thing lights up.
mm,
When they started showing pictures of people that were deemed not good, right, by society, what you're, especially like if you're in the States, right? Like if you show like a picture of someone who's like a homeless person, or like, someone who's like sort of like in a parade, right? Again, the two LGBTQIA plus kind of
mm,
community being represented. What was happening was that that part of the brain doesn't light up.
mm,
Like you're actually processing the stimulus as a thing, like as an object. And I know that there's been a lot of talk about that kind of in the way that we treat one another, like, this is a human being and all these things. And it was devastating to sort of see that it's like, oh, like we we actually were very right. Like this isn't just something quote unquote emotional. Again, I have
mm,
issues with people using emotional as a pejorative, but like whatever. Um, no, but like this is just an emotional thing. It's like, no, like you physically are not processing this stimulus properly as a human being. This is an object. It's not lighting up in your brain. And so when we're having again these conversations about disgust and the dehumanizing aspect of disgust, right? That is something that has to be factored into the conversation, because I think a lot of the times we often say things in kind of just like our normal colloquial vernacular ways, but I don't think we've really reckoned with the reality of what that means.
Wow.
To say that this is a thing actually is not hyperbolic.
Mhm.
That's the hard part, right? Because you want to say that, like, oh, that person is being mean, that person is just whatever. It's just like, no, from like a physical perspective, like these people are not being processed as in your brain as a human.
Wow. Wow. Which then allows for all kinds of weird stuff. In Augustine's case, it was
Right?
the use of state violence against your
Yeah,
theological opponents, right?
exactly.
So you're bringing the scientific interdisciplinary perspective into your work as a theologian and your PhD studies around Augustine. Tell us a little bit about how um, Augustine's theology of disgust work, specifically around the Donatist controversy. And for those of us who may not be familiar with the
Right.
Donatist controversy, a brief introduction to that a little
Yeah.
bit.
Brief introduction. 303 CE, you have sort of like the persecution that happens under Diocletian. Uh, Things kind of ended by 305. 311, you're kind of like, yay, everyone is okay now. And so what happened was there were a group of people called the Laps. They were people who uh, basically during the time of persecution either gave up sacred documents, recanted their faith, all of these things. And so what happens is that they're wanting to come back to the church. So one group says, yes, you can come back. One group says, no, you can't. And then that became eventually the Donatist faction. And so by the time that Augustine comes in, like this has already been happening, like for a while, I think about 80 years. And so initially, Augustine was against state violence, the use of coercion. Um, the pen is mightier than the sword kind of conversation. But then later, he he shifts and he actually uses the Bible. Oh, where do we see this? Uh, the Bible as
Mm,
the main reason, right? And so
wow.
using sort of like the example of like, yeah, like Sarah and Hagar kind of thing. And basically what happens is that I am doing you a favor, right? Because you're you're wilding out right now. You don't know truth. I know truth.
Mm,
And so I need you to come back to the truth. And if state violence is the means by which I can get you back to your senses,
mm,
well, I guess this is the tool, right?
wow.
And so y- the types of reasoning that he uses are like a lot of it is still at play, right? And so, for example, the idea of like the teacher, right? Like I'm here to help you learn, right? You're lost. I need you to do better, and this is kind of like the way I do
Mm,
that. Another one that we often use a lot, right, in these types of scenarios is the doctor with the scalpel, right? It's I am technically hurting you,
mm,
right? Because I'm cutting you open or whatever. But the harm that I'm doing, which is a harm, it is a harm. You're cutting someone, right? Like we have to admit that that is a harm, right? But the harm that I'm doing offsets the benefits of what you'll get after this, which is wellness and health, right?
mm,
And so those types of thinking to sort of uh, advocate for certain measures are still at play right now, right? Like the benevolent benefactor is still at play in a lot of like very oppressive regimes, right? And
mm,
colonization, right? Philippines. So I'm a Filipino. Uh, One of the biggest kind of stories, right, is that where these infantilized little kids that don't know anything and
mm,
um, someone needs to come to teach us how to be civilized, right? And so when the Americans came, it's always funny because we're Catholics. so so in terms of the Christian part, like I don't really get it, right?
mm,
But but again, right, one of the things that happens in these types of conversations is that the methods will keep on changing to adapt to the situation. But I think sometimes when the method changes, we think that the ideology changes
mm,
because they're so close to one another, right? But it's just like, but they're still all running through the same thread, right? And so, in terms of the Donatist controversy and the role of disgust, in that becomes like a way forward, right? Because the I don't want you to I don't want you to be in sin. I don't want you to go to hell. Right? And if this little thing that I'm doing, aka state violence, I got this little thing, right? This little thing called state violence, if that's what I have to do
mm,
to get you back into the fold, then that's perfectly acceptable, right? Because and I I didn't say this in my dissertation, but I will say it now.
yeah.
Your eschatology will definitely affect your theology, and especially with disgust. Eschatology really becomes like a huge, huge factor, and I think we don't really give that a lot of airplay because I think when we think of eschatology, we often just think rapture of all of these things. No, 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 but like the way that you are now going to allow for certain things is going to be it's okay, right? Because if the grand scheme is
Mm,
hell and I need to save you from that, and I have a very limited time until the trumpet sounds, we gotta work.
mm,
We gotta
mm,
work, 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 right? And so the time is coming, right? So you have this like I mean, to say urgency is to not even, it's, you have this urgency, this sense of urgency that
yeah.
Jesus is coming back. You have to make sure that you're trying to get everyone ready for the day of judgment. What is a little violence to further things along? It's just like
Mm,
you know, in a lot of organizations right now, we talk a lot about like collaboration, co-design, co-create, right? And it's just like, and then like, uh, timeline wise, we don't have the time. So now I'm going to take over and just do everything. Right.
mm,
So it's like, look, I gave you enough time.
mm,
Jesus is coming.
mm,
You're not acting fast enough for your repentance.
mm.
So why
Yeah,
don't we just hurry that path along to repentance? So
yeah,
here we go.
and this ends justify the means kind of thinking. We see that with Augustine's just war theory too, which is then used today to bomb innocent children in
Yeah.
Gaza and
Yeah.
justify an oppressive Israeli empire that displaces peoples who've been indigenous to the land, right, through settler violence that continues even when the news cycle has moved on. And so, yeah,
And again, with
yeah.
that in mind, right? What is your eschatology?
Mm,
Why are you okay with that?
exactly.
Why? Why are you okay with that? Well, I'm okay because what you're seeing as genocide, I'm seeing as preparing the way of the Lord. That changes, I think, the narrative, right? And it's just like you hear that and you're just like, that's off. But because you've been in that space for so long, I honestly don't think that you can see how that is wrong anymore. Right. And
Mm,
and again, like this is how like all of the connection with disgust comes in, right? With us,
yeah.
at least when it comes to like eschatology, is because this is no longer a site of disgust,
Mm,
right? Because this becomes a site of future triumph.
mm,
So that is going to change the way, right? So I think a lot of the times we often see uh the confrontations like, why don't you feel pain? Why don't you feel hurt when you see all of, these children that are being bombed and killed and all of these things?
yeah.
And it's just like, but they're not children.
But
They're objects. And just like, but then you
yeah,
say that, it's like, well, that's me. And I'm just like, why are you complaining to me that that's me? Tell that to the people who be bombing people.
yeah, yeah,
Right? Like,
yeah.
so I think that's kind of the difficulty sometimes in the conversation is because what you think should be
Mm,
a site of disgust,
mm,
right, becomes a site of normalized reality.
yeah, yeah.
So, how are we going to talk about disgust when this is not a site of disgust?
Mm,
This is
mm,
a site of future triumph. This is a site of normalcy.
yeah. What comes
That
to
is a
mind?
harder conversation.
Totally, totally. What comes to mind for me is a professor of mine, a dispensationalist professor of mine in seminary, writing an article after Israel starts bombing Gaza, writes an article for Christianity Today, basically saying, "What does it matter? They're a bunch of Baal worshippers anyway, right?" This is it. This is a theology of
Yeah.
disgust that we're talking
Yeah.
about, which has so much of its roots in the Christian church in Augustine, right? Like
Yeah.
it goes back to Augustine, and this is relevant with the larger conversation we're having now on how Augustine opposed Pelagius and the Celtic Christians, misrepresented them, got the emperor to declare them as heretics so that they could persecute them. After three church councils, two in Palestine, one in Vatican, had acknowledged that Pelagius was within the bounds of orthodoxy. Augustine still appeals to state power, and it's the same thing that you then see with the Donatists, right? It's a pattern with this person
Mhm.
of really unhealed, untransformed parts to them that spill over. Or as I said in a recent Substack post, some men would rather become doctors of the church than go to therapy. Uh,
Absolutely. And when I saw that, I was just like, well, you're not going to get a no from me.
yeah.
Like, okay, easy sell, right? But I think part of one of the difficulties too, right, is sort of
Mm,
because I want to talk about like the unhealed parts because this is something that I've often thought about, like especially when it comes to Augustine, right? Like this man has literally been traumatized, right? And I think maybe we don't necessarily sometimes factor that part and why is he acting the way that he's been acting.
yeah. Tell us more about that.
Um,
Yeah.
so I have a love-hate relationship with Augustine. Um, because so when the Donatist controversy was happening,
Mm,
uh, the Donatists were actually the majority, and
mm,
Augustine was actually not in the majority,
mm,
right? And the Donatists were doing some shady things, aka killing, violence, ambushes, whatever. And so if I was Augustine, right? And I was just like, you know what? We need peace. We need peace. And then you be trying to ambush me. I think I'm gonna be okay with state violence now.
mm. Yep. Yep.
So I think this is kind of like the complicated relationship I have with I guess because I'm like, if I were him and I was sort of in this same scenario, I don't know if I would also be going like, yay,
Mm,
love, yay, peace. Like, you're trying to kill me, bro. Like,
yeah. And
maybe.
and yet what's fascinating, Sid, is while that's a normal Christian response today in many circles, back in Augustine's time, that was not the norm. The church were
Definitely.
pacifists up until
Yeah,
him, right? That
exactly.
no one would
Yeah.
do this kind of stuff.
Oh, totally.
And he
Totally.
he tested the boundaries there and taught
Yeah.
the church something new.
And he like I think he was able to not only just test the boundaries, but like redefine the boundaries.
Yeah.
Right. Um and the thing though that I think is also just like fascinating, I think, about Augustine and I think about the church, right, is that this is the same conversation that I've had with people about Trump.
Mm,
I don't like Trump, but Trump would not be where he is if he was not put in that position by certain people.
mhm.
So sometimes I have more issues with like the supporters than the actual person because the person would not be here if you didn't support him.
Yep.
And I think sometimes it's a lot easier for us, for me, right, to be like, see, Augustine is like this, like, bad villain or whatever, right? I'm not going to disagree.
No,
Right?
no, no. No, preach it,
But I
totes,
will
yeah.
say, right, that you had a choice,
Yes.
right? Like he said all of these things, right? But you did not have to listen.
Mm,
You did not have to follow. You did not have to continue to propagate that.
mm,
So what does that I feel like that says so much more about us and Augustine, to be honest,
mm,
which is I think I feel like that's the reckoning that we really need to start having within like our whatever theological system that you're in, right? Is that one of the beauties I think about Christianity is that it has always had multiple voices, even from the very beginning, right? There was never this like univocal church thing, right? You had uh, people saying different things about Jesus. You had, like, and that's why you had a council to just be like, all right, like, oh, so what do we think? Right? Because
mm.
everyone's saying this, that, and the other. We're trying to figure things out, right?
Yeah. And
But
it was
there
an
was
emperor,
only
like, as creedal
right,
as I am, it was an emperor being like, "Hey, figure it out. This is causing disunity in the empire.
right,
We want unity and uniformity. So what are the
right,
basics that you can agree on?" And that's how we have the
right.
Nicene Creed. Yeah.
And so we basically have these sort of the space where there has always been multiple voices.
Mm.
And so if there are multiple voices and you choose this voice to follow, that's on you. Like, you know what I mean? You tend to pick another guy.
Yep.
You tend to pick another woman to follow. There are so many examples.
Yep.
In Christianity to follow, right? Like one
Yes.
is one. So I feel like that says more about you
Mm.
than the person that you're trying to follow because that person wouldn't be here without you. So is it really him or is it really you at this point? Like,
Yeah.
look, Augustine is dead, right? There's no reason why this is the school of thought that you should be following,
Mm.
right? Um, but also, I also just think that like we're all complicated humans,
Yeah.
right? Lord knows if someone reads something I wrote before I started this decolonization journey, they would be putting me like, be like, that's a no. Yeah, I know, I agree.
Yeah.
The one good thing that I will say about Augustine is that at the end of his life, near the end of his life, he had retracciones, which is retractions.
Hmm.
And basically, he went back to all of the stuff that he did and was just like, this is probably like a better way of saying that, or y'all definitely misunderstood me on this, and so this is not like I'm setting. But there was always this sense of like, at least for me, like a self humility of being like, I've grown, and part of growing means changing or reformulating some things, and I'm okay with that.
Beautiful.
Right? So I think my anger and frustration, right, is that if this man had the self awareness to look back and be like, messed up on that one, should have said this better. If you're really following him, where's your retractions?
Hmm.
Tell me where your retractions are. Where are they? Because why have your sense of this person and their teachings been so fossilized?
Yeah.
And if you're of the Protestant persuasion, semper reformandum. You should always be reforming. So there's
Yeah.
literally no excuse for you. Whether you kind of go from a Catholic perspective or a more Protestant perspective, there's no reason for you to not be constantly challenging your thoughts and your ideas.
Yeah.
Sure, you may start off in this particular manner, right? But there are ways for you to be like, okay, does that still hold today? Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is also where I think sometimes in a lot of, I would say like a lot of like religious sort of like organizations, I don't think that we pay close enough attention, I
Hmm.
think, to the distinction between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law.
Hmm.
Right. The letter of the law was built because of the spirit of the law, right? And so, like for example, you have a child, right? Let's put a gate because they be running everywhere, right? Um, and they're young, right? So the letter of the law is must have like a safety gate, right? That child is now 14, 15 years old. The letter of the law says there has to be a safety gate. But what was the spirit of the law?
Hmm.
The spirit of the law was to prevent this child who did not have the mobility that you now have as a 14, 15-year-old to like escape, right? Like, so the reason why the safety gate was put in place was to prevent you from accidents, right? Because of the current circumstances that is in front of me, aka a child who does not have complete control yet of their mobility functions.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening is that, well, dad said there has to be a safety gate. Okay,
Hmm.
but why? Why is the safety gate there? And sometimes we don't really ask the why. Okay, but they said this oppressive thing or whatever. Okay, but like why though?
Hmm.
Are we asking kind of like what brought this about?
Hmm.
And if those particular conditions are no longer at play, why are we still acting as if the letter of the law is actually in conjunction and in alignment with the spirit of the law?
Yeah.
It's no longer there. The circumstances have changed, right? So then, if the spirit of the law is about the protection of the child, those circumstances, those variables are no longer at play.
Hmm. Hmm.
Why do we still have security gate then? That I think is my issue right now with a lot of these conversations.
Yes. Yes. Sid, if I can just jump in there, the thing that comes to mind for me is it's fascinating the connections you're making here, because what ends up happening in church history is the Catholic Church moderates Augustine after his death. They recognize that hey, he had a moment. There was a lot going on, and he had all kinds of repressed trauma. I mean, and before even persecution, like his sex addiction trauma, right? Like, I mean, there's an addiction aspect to his trauma there. So he had all this trauma that was unprocessed and spilling over. And of course, they didn't use that language. We didn't have mental health awareness back then, but um, it was on the lines of, no, we're going to moderate him. We're going to choose to remember the best of him. And yeah, there's some other stuff too that maybe we're not going to be as honest about. But what's happened is you canonize someone as a saint, and I love the saints. I mean, clearly, look at the icons behind me. But the thing is, human empire shaped binary brains have this tendency to see someone as a saint or a scoundrel, an oppressed or an oppressor, not recognizing that these aren't fixed categories. Or as Gregory of Nazianzus, an early church father, would say, all of us have wheat and chaff within us, right? All of us have sheep and goat, wheat and tares within us. And
And
when,
what does the parable say? Let them grow.
yeah, that's it. Let them grow. Wow.
I'm just saying.
That's so good.
I'm just saying.
That's so good.
And
That's
and
so
and
good.
that is more for me because I think my tendency be like, gotta remove it. It's just like, you know what, you don't know. I think for me, and this is something that I really have to tell myself because I think my tendency is more fatalistic. Uh, but redemption always has to be on the table.
Mm,
No matter who that person is, redemption still has to be on the table. What does that redemption look like? That is the hard work that we are all called to process and figure things out, right? But redemption has to be on the table.
yeah.
The complicated part, what would be the connection between redemption and accountability?
Mm, mm,
What is the connection between redemption and truth telling? These are the hard questions that
right.
are we are asked to come together
Mm,
and be like, no one person can answer that question. There's just no way, right? And I think this is where I really truly appreciate, I think, the ecumenical nature of councils.
mm,
Because for a council to be convened, I think sometimes people forget that, like, the reason why they're convened is because there are literal differences of opinion.
mm,
And we don't value the difference of opinion enough. Why do we not have a council? We're all in silos. What's there to fight about? There's no need for you and me to try to parse this situation out. What situation? There's no situation.
yeah.
There's one thought, right, that predominates the conversation. And so there's no longer a need for a council because technically that would mean opposition, and we don't like opposition. We literally put them on the other end.
Yeah.
So, how are you going to have a council? How can you even have the concept of ecumenicalism when you are literally trying to flatten opinion everywhere you go?
Yeah. Yeah.
How's that
And
going?
and this was in the early church too, right? At some of these early councils, you had dudes getting punched in the face because of
And
disgust.
violent,
Yeah.
like fighting, huh? Like
But get
seriously.
in a room, right? Get in a room, be in relationship. Like, try not to punch each other in the
Yeah, yeah,
face,
yeah.
but
Right.
but get in the room and you'll get stuff coming out from that room then. So I
But
love that.
to sort of comment on that too, right? Is that I'm only going to be in the room with you if I have relation with you,
Yes.
right? And the problem is I'm disgusted by you, right? You're not a human being, let alone a Christian. Tell me again why we should be in the same room.
Wow.
Why are you in the same room as me? You're subhuman. You're demonic. You're this other.
Mm,
This and again, right? Like this is sort of like the continuing kind of like dilemma of not recognizing
mm,
like the bigger picture. It's just like, yeah, it would be great if, people with differing opinions would come together. But why would a human have this much consideration for an ant? If you step on an ant, you just keep on going.
mm,
Eschatology,
mm.
right? And so, because if you have like a proper eschatology, oh, proper, I put that in whatever, it would be great if you had sort of, I don't know, respect for life. That's not just human, not just human based, right? It's just like all life is sacred kind of thing. And so, in another setting, you stepping on an end and keeping going would be like, what? That's a life. That's sacred. You don't do that, right? But if again you're in a way of not necessarily valuing other non-human life as protected, then and this is where it's all interconnected, right? Because again, I'm only going to be on the same room with you if I see you as a human. You're demonic. Why would I think yeah, what has darkness to do with light? If
Oh,
I can be so cynical.
yeah, yeah. Ignoring, as ancient Celtic Christians would say, all of us have the light of God in us, every being in creation, the ants, which the Bible talks about.
Right?
Go learn from the ant, because the light of God is in the ant as well.
Yeah.
But you're so right. We are conditioned by empire to be disgusted by the other, so we don't learn from the other, and instead of learning from Celtic Christian perspectives, which actually could have been quite healing for Augustine's untransformed
Right.
hearts. He cancels them. He declares them as heretics,
Right.
and
And even like talking about like the ant, right? Like I mean, even in Proverbs, right? You get a lot of like animal imagery, right? Of like things that you should probably be like following, like the ants that is so hardworking, right? And so again, like that, our relationship with like the the non-human counterparts, right? Don't tell me that that is not going to affect the way that you treat others.
yeah, come on,
Because for me, if I can value a flower, if I can value an ant, how could I not value a human? It just wouldn't make sense,
yeah.
right?
Hitler loved
But
his dog, but not the Jewish people because he was so
right? Yeah, right. And all of these things. And so like that again, right? It's just like the way that all of these things are so interconnected.
yeah.
Because there are some things that are kind of inevitable once you go down a certain path,
Mm,
right? If your theology doesn't necessarily value life, right? Then I don't know how you can have a theology that would value life. Right? Like,
yeah.
of course it
Yeah.
wouldn't. Like it's just like, oh, whatever, right? And so and again, like I think sometimes the hard part in all of this is that they're all interconnected. And
Mhm.
the moment that you sort of like, pull a thread, the whole thing unravels.
Yes.
Right. And so one of the things that I think definitely has shaped a lot of my thinking, I think it was in seminary where it was kind of like, we talk about like world Christianity or whatever, right?
Mm, mhm.
And then it's just like, is it world Christianity or is it world Christianities?
Mhm.
And you're like, what? Like, of course there's only one. Right? And you're like, huh? And then you start thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a Filipino linguist.
mm,
Rupani Tupas, I believe his name is, and he talked about sort of like world English,
mm,
right? Especially like Filipino English,
mm,
right? And the thing is, like Filipino English will have its own sort of kind of unique ways of doing grammar and vocabulary. And it's almost just like, oh, well, it's not English, English. So does it count as English? Right? Like that kind of conversations. And I'm just like, see,
yeah.
this is what happens when you have that type of empirical thinking, right? Of just like, this
Is it?
is how?
Is it?
Because you think that's not going to affect your language. You think that's
Yeah.
not going to affect your thought patterns. You're not going to think about like the way that you think about the other.
Uh, and I mean, on that topic, India actually has the world's largest English speaking population. Indian English is the largest dialect of English in the world. But you're right with the empirical understanding.
Is
Soon
it
people are
English
racist.
though?
Right.
Is
Exactly.
it English? The fact that you can even ask that question after it said Indian English, and then you go, well, is it English though? It's like, well, I don't know how to talk to you because you
Exactly.
have literally told me it is by calling it thus,
Right.
but you're
Right.
all, but I think that's also, I think, like the power of the empire, right? Is that it's able to do double speak. Because technically, right, it says Indian English, right? And you're recognizing it as a variation of
Totally.
English, right?
Totally.
But how can you recognize it as a variation of English and at the same time say
That's it.
not English?
Exactly. Who gets to
How
decide?
does that work?
Right. Right. Also,
How?
I'm curious, as we're closing on time here, just to draw us back a little bit to theology of disgust. And this is I'm not expecting you to have a perfect answer on this, but just because you really wrestled with this more than certainly I and most of us have in the church, um, how how would you say we can overcome this disgust towards our neighbor? How would you say, what are some helpful ways, practical ways, even thinking of everyday Jesus followers, listening to this, churches, like what would you say is a helpful way forward to overcome this disgust, to see our neighbors made in the image and fingerprints of God and have a light go off in our brain?
Right.
Um,
I would probably say the first thing that comes to mind, travel.
wow.
Physically, if you have the finances,
Mm,
through books if you don't, right? Like I when I say travel, right? Like I want to make it as inclusive as possible. There, I absolutely know, especially in this economy, like how is anyone traveling? Uh, but I I think when you travel, what you end up realizing is that normal is not the normal,
mm,
right? And you suddenly see different ways of being than what
mm,
you've been exposed to.
mm,
And so I think that would be like my number one. Please travel, right? And if you can't sort of like physically travel, look up the history of Italy, look at the history of Colombia, read the books that would sort of give you a better way of understanding all of the things, right? And know the history of the countries that you may not even really care about.
mm.
And I almost would say like pick a country that you know nothing about. And that's the one that you go read, right?
Wow.
Because there's something to be said about learning a new culture
Mm,
because it just naturally challenges the status quo,
mm,
right? And I think for me, the whole process, I think of disgust and learning more about disgust is that so many of it is so cultural,
mm,
right? And so, for example, the serpent in Western theology, whatever, right, is this deceitful thing.
mm.
But in the East, the serpent is wise. And literally the antithesis, right? Like wisdom, and like this is a sage, like like all of like the enlightenment, like all of like the higher virtues, right? It would be that would be the epitome. Whereas in the West, it's literally the exact opposite, right? But why is it that this one stimuli is producing two different effects? The only reason, culture, right? Like,
Wow.
so learn more about others, learn more about sort of different cultures and all of these things. Like travel is like it's such a huge part, I think, of kind of decentering what you think is the status quo, right? The second one I would say, and it's kind of related to that, is being very intentional about the content you consume on social media. So find indigenous TikTok
Mm,
creator, right? Find racialized, Instagram content creators, right? Um, be very intentional because that's not something that's going to naturally happen. We are creatures of habit,
mhm,
right? And so we're just going to do what we want. And if you're not careful, your algorithm will do what they think you want, right? So being very intentional about looking for different voices that honestly challenges you. It's almost just like the more you hate this person, honestly, like the more you should go like listen to
mm,
sort of like that type of rhetoric, right? Because a lot of the conversations we're having are really conversations that are happening in silo, which is really sad, right?
wow.
I don't think that it's I find it a problem because the scriptures often talks about the Christian as an ambassador.
Mm, mm,
The way that ambassadors worked back in the day was that they would literally put you as a child, go be worded into like the other country. You grow up there, right? So that you have no technically no allegiance, right? Neither side likes you. Right? Because you're you're too Indian to be Canadian, but you're too
mhm,
Canadian to be Indian. And so you're living in that liminal space. And I think as as followers of the way, I think we need to be more like living in that liminal space of,
mm,
kind of just like we need to know what's happening in our world, right? We need to be affected by the world, but not controlled by the world, right? And so, how do you sort of figure that out? Well, you're not going to figure that out if you just stay in your own little world. Find the other worlds that are there that you literally will not find until you aggressively look for it.
so good. So good.
Do I know any Black Christians? No. Do you have any Black friends? No. Of course. How are you going to find? They're never there. Oh, dude, is there any like good like female theologian? No. Are you secretly on the manosphere? Yes. Huh. Funny how you couldn't find any good,
Mm,
you know, female theologians.
amazing. Wow.
I wonder why. Right? Because you're surrounding yourself with the same voice, right? So
Yeah,
actively
yeah.
go out.
So good, Doctor said. Doctor said, uh, I've known you as Sid as a long time. You've known me as Joash for a long time. So it's fun to be in a space where you can call me Father Joash, I call you Dr. Sid.
Yes.
But man, I am so grateful for you, your wisdom, your expertise, really your pastoral humility too. So much of the things you were saying here are so pastoral, so priestly, and just so grateful for your work. Where can people find you on the internet? Where can
Kind
people
of
follow your work?
everywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm on Facebook. I'm also in on Instagram, Dr. Sid underscore S. Um, I'm technically on Substack, but not really. But thank you, because for now I'm gonna try and I've always been like, "Oh, I need to get on this thing and whatever." So I'll try to create more content, and by try to create more content, try to create any content at this point.
Well, I,
But yeah, so those
yeah,
would really be sort of like Facebook,
yeah,
Instagram, kind of where I kind of live.
amazing. And I know you've got a full plate. There's seasons in life when we're in survival mode, especially as academics. But I just want to affirm that you have so much wisdom, um,
Yeah.
insight to offer to the world right now. And I'm so glad I could introduce you to my community here. I'll just say this yeah, if for whatever it's worth, my encouragement or the encouragement of the folks who are listening and who will respond to this as well, who will engage with your social media Substack. Yeah, hope you find spaces to continue putting this wisdom out into the world, even if it's not as a public theologian,
Yeah,
local church settings, because you really have this depth of insight to offer to us. And
I think
shame on us for not recognizing that in you, to your point earlier.
that's called the empire.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yes.
one of the things too that I kind of want to talk about that, right? Because a lot of the times, we often think that the system is broken, right? It's like the system is not broken. The system is functioning the way it's supposed to be. There's a reason why the voices are not coming for me. They're not inviting me because I don't know if I ever get invited back if I said the things that say, right? And so we're we all say we want to, challenge status quo, but when challenging the status quo is also potentially challenging financial donation,
Yep. Yep.
that's a different conversation, right? And so if and again, not just me, right? But like if certain voices are not in the spaces where you think they should be, you should always wonder why they're not.
Yeah.
Because as you said, we're like, oh, like you're smart, you're this, you're that. It's like, but why aren't you? Interesting. Good to know. Right. But why? It's like, could it possibly be that as much as we say we want to change the status quo, we
Yeah.
want to say we changed it for performative reasons so we can act like, oh, EDIB, whatever. That's equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging for all of the people who don't know that acronym. But is that why?
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And this is exactly why it's important for folks listening to support content creators, theologians, voices that challenge the status quo, especially if they come from underrepresented communities in the public square, right? Like I was
Mhm.
shocked. I mean, there are 1.4 billion Indians, millions of Indian Christians, hundreds of thousands in the West, and like half a dozen Indian origin authors in top
Mhm.
10 publishing, Christian publishing that I can think of, right? And so when I got into that myself, I was like, oh my goodness, we're really underrepresented here. And I mean,
Yeah.
Filipinos, even less, even a
Yeah.
lot less, right? So
Yeah.
again, folks, as many folks here are in seasons where you're in between churches, you're trying to figure out, you were used to tithing that 10% net, to your church, and now, or gross to your church. Now you're kind of like, what do I do with some of that? Well, you can become a paid subscriber to said Substack, to my Substack. You can, create spaces of wrestling and invite voices like Dr. Sid to come and honor him for his time, as I will for his time here as well. So, so whatever that looks like, let's be creative uh, in our peaceful resistance to empire, even in this where voices are being suppressed actively. But
And this
y-
is again call back to the comment, right? Of who are you following?
yes, that's it.
Right. So who?
Exactly it.
Why? Always have that, at your like just like ready to come out of your mouth, right?
Yeah.
Why am I doing this? Why am I following this person? Why
Mhm.
is the system acting the way that it's supposed to be? What is supposed to be? All of these things are so important. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this space because there's so much to be said about racialized siblings supporting each other. We have been put in competition,
Ugh,
right?
it's
And
true.
the
Yeah.
lower you are on the Asian totem pole, oh, sorry, we totem pole. We are not saying that anymore because that's of a racist nature. Where you are in the Asian org chart, you know. Um, again, retractions. I said something wrong in the moment. Be like, ooh, caught myself.
Practicing, practicing what you preach. Love it.
I
Love
could
it.
think, and so and
Yeah.
Southeast Asians, we're there.
Right. Totally.
And it brings about so much competition rather than collaboration.
Hmm.
We can only do this together. And we like I cannot express enough how much solidarity is the only way to go. This can only happen through solidarity and unity.
Wow. Wow. I love that. I was in a class yesterday. One of my students was like, this word solidarity keeps popping up. I feel like it's the Holy Spirit. And you just went there without me bring so love it. I hope my student watches
Because it
this.
is the whole spirit.
Love it. Love it.
The
And I'm
the unity
yes.
of
Yeah.
the
Totally. And if I can close with this thought, I'll just say solidarity is ultimately what Jesus shows to us as humankind, right? When he refuses to otherize us. He travels, like you said, he journeys, he comes into our world, becomes incarnate, lives a full life as a marginalized human being, teaches, is killed by our worst instincts, by empire, literally, and defeats death by doing what empire told him not to do, which is die. It comes back to life. So this is the work that we're then called to as the church, as people who follow Jesus, to be rooted in that work of death and resurrection, putting to death the things that need to be put death to, and then the resurrection of all things, which includes solidarity and conversations like this. Dr. Sid, thank you again for your wisdom, your presence, and hope folks subscribe to your Substack, follow you on Instagram, social media. And I'm sure this won't be the last conversation we have here. So I look forward to our future conversations as well. Yeah,
same. Thank you so much for having me.
absolutely. Blessings, brother.